Hello, everyone, and happy Sabbath. Today's topic is going to be on the Locust King. Locust King shows up in the Bible in the book of Revelation. We'll try to figure out exactly who the locusts are, who their king is, and we'll try to fill in some of the blanks. It's a bit of a mystery, and we'll look at all the verses, literally all the verses having to do with the locusts. I actually combed through the Bible, and I took a look at every verse I could find in the Old Testament for locust in Hebrew, and every time I could find it in the New Testament in Greek.
Ezekiel 33:3.
So the locust appears 24 times in the Old Testament, and it appears only 4 times in the New Testament. 2 of the times it appears in the New Testament is in the book of Revelation, and then twice in the Gospel. So we'll start off first with the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew word is 697, which is arbe. And arbe it just says a kind of a locust. Now, locust in like a scientific sense is talking about anything that potentially could have like a hard exoskeleton. So insects of most kinds have a typically hard exoskeleton, and then the inside they're all mushy. So a crab, a crustacean, a shrimp, those would all also count as locusts. So I just wanted to kind of give some context to the idea that the locust could be something a little bit wider than what we think it is. We're going to take a look in the Old Testament. It brings it up and actually refers to as a type of insect. Now, locust, a lot of people, when they think locust in their head, they think a grasshopper. It could be a grasshopper, but when I did a lot of research into just the word locust in general, I found that it even covered crustaceans. So we'll take a look and try to discern and figure out what context the locust is being described as when it's in the Bible. In the New Testament, the word is akri. So that's 200, and that's in the Greek. So we've got the New Testament in Greek, the Old Testament in Hebrew, and we have the 2 variations of the word locust. So usually when I start these kinds of Bible studies where I'm trying to figure out a word or a topical study, I typically start off with figuring out where does the word first show up in the Bible. So the question is, where does the word locust first appear in the Bible? The answer is the book of Exodus. So what we'll do is we'll do a little bit of a build-up to where it is in the Bible, and that way we can get the context of the first time it's described. Exodus 1:8-11. Then a new king who did not know Joseph came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become too numerous and too powerful for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase even more. And if war breaks out, they may join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So the Egyptians appointed taskmasters over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor. As a result, they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for the Pharaoh. So this is when the Israelites were basically taken as slaves in Egypt. They had moved there at the end of Genesis, and then now after their ancestor Joseph died, they're now being burdened with these hard tasks. During this period of time, a child called Moses was born, placed in a basket made of reed, and then he became the, I guess, son of the Pharaoh, or at least the daughter of the Pharaoh was raising him, while the mother kind of initially watched from afar, but then the mother had the opportunity to actually raise her child. So if we take a look at the lineages, we can see where this child came from. So we're jumping down a bit. So we've passed Adam and Eve, obviously. We've passed the flood. We're starting from Abraham. So from Abraham, we have Abraham and Sarah have a child called Isaac. And then Isaac and his wife Rebecca have 2 children. One is Esau, one is Jacob. These 2 are twins. We're not focused on Esau, we're focused on Jacob. Jacob is where we get the name Israel from, as Jacob was renamed Israel in the Bible. So you can either call these people the Israelites or the Jacobites. So Jacob had multiple wives. One of his wives was Leah, and Leah is where he had the children Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Dinah. Levi is where we find Moses. So Levi is where we get the word Levites, and the Levites were the priests. The lineage of the Levites. First, we have Levi, and then Kohath, and Amram. Amram is the father of Moses, and then Jochebed is the mother. So Amram and Jochebed had the children Aaron, Moses, and Miriam. So Aaron's the high priest in the Bible. He's the first high priest, and then the role of being high priest and priest in the temple went down through his bloodline. And then Moses was the prophet that we saw with Aaron in Egypt. So Moses grows older and he slays an Egyptian man, an Egyptian guard, and then he ends up fleeing to the land of Midian. While he's in Midian, he meets Jethro, and then this is where he meets his wife. But he encounters this burning bush in Exodus 3:14. The burning bush told him to go back to Egypt. It was the Lord, and the Lord gave him his name so he could convince the people to come with him out of Egypt. So Moses was to be God to the Pharaoh, and Aaron his prophet. Then there was the first plague. It was blood in the river Nile of Egypt. The second plague was an infestation of frogs. The third plague, swarms of gnats. The fourth plague, masses of flies or just insects in general. The fifth plague was the death of all livestock. The sixth plague, disease and boils. The seventh plague, storm and giant hail. And the eighth plague, the plague of locusts. This is the first place we actually see the word locust recorded anywhere in the Bible. Exodus 10:1-6. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his officials, that I may perform these miracle signs of mine among them, and that you may tell your children and grandchildren how severely I dealt with the Egyptians when I performed miraculous signs among them, so that all of you may know that I am the Lord." So Moses and Aaron went to the Pharaoh and told him, "This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. How long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go, so that they may worship me. But if you refuse to let my people go," and here it is, "I will bring locusts into your territory tomorrow. They will cover the face of the land so that no one can see it. They will devour what is left after the hail and eat every tree that grows in your fields. They will fill your houses and they will fill your houses and the houses of all your officials, and every Egyptian, something neither your fathers nor your grandfathers have seen since the day they came into this land." Then Moses turned and left the Pharaoh's presence. So what we can read so far from Genesis 10, it leads us to believe, obviously, that the locusts being described here are insects. They're filling the houses, they're devouring the trees, they're eating all the food. Exodus 10:7-12. Pharaoh's officials asked him, "How long will this man be a snare to us? Let the people go, so that they may worship their Lord their God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is in ruins?" So Moses and Aaron were taken back to the Pharaoh. "Go worship the Lord your God," he said. "But who exactly will be going?" "We will go with our young and old," Moses replied. "We will go with our sons and daughters, and with our flocks and herds, for we must hold a feast to the Lord." Then Pharaoh told them, "May the Lord be with you if I ever let you go with your little ones. Clearly, you are bent on evil. No, only the men will go and worship the Lord, since that is what you have been requesting." And Moses and Aaron were driven from the Pharaoh's presence. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the land of Egypt, so that locusts may swarm over it and devour every plant in the land, everything that the hail has left behind." So Moses stretched his staff over the land of Egypt, and throughout that day and night, the Lord sent an east wind across the sea. By morning, the east wind had brought the locusts. The locusts swarmed from the land and settled over the territory of Egypt. Never before has there been so many locusts, and never again will there be. They covered the face of all the land until it was black, and they consumed all the plants on the ground and all the fruit on the trees that the hail had left behind. Nothing green was left on any tree or plant in the land of Egypt. Pharaoh quickly summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "I have sinned against the Lord, your God, and against you. Now please forgive my sin one more and appeal to the Lord your God that he may remove this death from me." So Moses left Pharaoh's presence and appealed to the Lord. And the Lord changed the wind to a very strong west wind, which carried off the locusts and blew them into the Red Sea. Not a single locust remained anywhere in Egypt, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go. One of the things I want to point out is where the locusts came from and where they went back to. When they came into Egypt, they came from an east wind. So that means they were coming from the east. When the locusts were put away, the locusts were carried towards the west and came into the Red Sea. So just looking at the first time that the locusts appear in the Bible, it looks like the symbol is pointing towards the east. If we take a look here at this word arba, arba is the word locust in the Bible, 697. If we look, it has an origin. The word origin is Rabbah, R-A-B-A-H. If we look at the word Rabbah, Rabbah means to be or become much, many, or great. Locusts were depicted as insects in the Bible in the following places. Exodus 10, which we just read, the 8th plague in Egypt. They show up again in Leviticus 11 and 22, and it has to do with the Leviticus dietary laws. According to Leviticus, you're able to eat locusts, in other words, grasshoppers. And you'll see the same thing actually in the New Testament, which we'll see shortly. Deuteronomy 28 and 38, they're talked about within the curses. 1 Kings 8 and 37, Solomon's prayer for the temple. They show up again in 2 Chronicles 6 and 28 because it's a parallel of 1 Kings 8 and 37. Again, Solomon's prayer for the temple. In Psalm 78 and 46, they show up in the plagues of Egypt. Now, Psalms is actually referencing back to Exodus. So in Psalm 78 and Psalms 105, you're both seeing this description of what happened in Egypt with the plagues. Proverbs 30, 24 to 28, when they're spoken of as small but exceedingly wise creatures. And they're spoken of along with the ant, the rock badger, and then the locust, obviously, and the lizard. In Matthew 3:4, John the Baptist is eating locusts and honey. So John the Baptist was by the River Jordan baptizing. He was wearing camel's hair, and he was living off of locusts and honey. The locusts, however, are not just depicted as insects in the Bible. The locusts are also depicted as an army. What I've always found really interesting is when you read the Bible, when it talks about creation, you don't really see a description that speaks too much about where insects came from, unless we're talking about the creeping things. But it's kind of interesting because we have a world that's full of insects and we don't really have too much explanation about them. But we have this interesting dichotomy in the Bible where these locusts are described as both insects, but in later parts of the Bible, it's a symbol for an army. Joel 2:25, we can clearly see it's an army. I will repay you for the years eaten by locusts, the swarming locust, the young locust, the destroying locust, and the devouring locust. And then it says, my great army that I sent against you. So in Joel, in the 2nd chapter, it seems to refer to the locusts as God's army. Here are the different verses and books where you see the locust depicted as an army in the Bible. Judges 6:5, the Midianites, so Moses, for example, he was the son-in-law of Jethro. Jethro was a Midianite. Midianites were compared to locusts. Judges 7 and 12, Midianites, Amalekites, and people of the east compared to locusts. Now, why is that important? Well, because when we read about locusts first appearing in the book of Exodus, what direction did they come from? They came from the east, and then they were pushed back with a western wind. Job 39 and 20, they were compared to a horse rider. That's quite different. So you have a locust, which is a bug, but then you're comparing a bug to a horse. Jeremiah 46 and 23, Egypt more numerous than the locusts. So Egypt was being described as being more numerous than locusts. In the book of Nahum 3:17, Nineveh's guards are compared to swarming locusts and scribes to clouds of locusts. In the book of Joel chapter 1, locusts are used to describe an invading nation with teeth of a lion and fangs of a lioness. So now we're seeing a couple different symbols here. The locust is being referred to like a horse, but also having teeth of a lion and fangs of a lioness. Joel 2 and 25. Locusts are described as God's great army sent against Israel. Why would God send his army against Israel? Because Israel was disobedient. And so God sent his army to correct. Revelation 9. Locusts are described as coming from the pits of hell. And then we have a very different description of the locusts there, which we'll take a look at later. So we have locusts in the Bible being depicted as two things, either as insects or being some kind of an army, some kind of a symbol that's referencing a nation of people or a nation of conquerors. In Joel 2, 1-6, blow the ram's horn in Zion, sound the alarm on my holy mountain. Let all who dwell in the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. So the prophet Joel, what we're seeing here in chapter 2, it's not talking about necessarily a present event, it's talking about a future event. Indeed, it is near, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and blackness, like the dawn overspreading the mountains. A great and strong army appears, such as never was of old, nor will ever be seen in ages to come. Before them a fire devours, and behind them a flame scorches. The land before them is like the Garden of Eden, but behind them it is like a desert wasteland. Surely nothing will escape them. Their appearance is like that of horses, and they gallop like swift steeds. With a sound like that of chariots, they bound over the mountaintops, like the crackling of fire consuming stubble, like a mighty army deployed for battle. Nations writhe in horror before them. Every face turns pale. So we're seeing a prophecy of something to happen in the future. And the locusts are being described as coming on the day of the Lord. And then we can see that, again, they're described like horses. And then you can see the nations will be very terrified of them. What's interesting is wherever they go, there's fire that goes ahead of them. Now, fire or flame is typically a symbol for the sun. The sun rises in the east. We see in Exodus also that the locusts are coming from the east. And of course, when the locusts go over this land, which is some kind of an army, it looks like Eden, it looks like a paradise. But once they go over it, it looks like the earth was scorched. It becomes a wasteland. Joel 2, 7-11. They charge like mighty men. They scale the walls like men of war. Each one marches in formation, not swerving from the course. They do not jostle one another. Each proceeds in his path. They burst through the defenses, never breaking ranks. They storm the city. They run along the wall. They climb into houses, entering through windows like thieves. So here you're kind of seeing what looks like an army, but also the way that this army is moving, it reminds you of an actual locust, the way they're climbing up walls. Before them, the earth quakes, the heavens rumble, the heavens tremble, the sun and moon grow dark, and the stars lose their brightness. The Lord raises his voice in the presence of his army. Indeed, his camp is very large. For mighty are those who obey his command. For the day of the Lord is great and very dreadful. Who can endure it? So again, we can see that Joel starts off speaking about the day of the Lord. And then here in verse 11, we can see it finishes reminding us that it's happening during the day of the Lord. And we can see that some of the events here are that the earth will tremble, and that the sun and the moon will grow dark, and the stars will lose their brightness. So it's like the sky itself is going to be blacked out. And then again, we get the confirmation that this army is the Lord's army. If we take a look, we have this word Gabor. So if we go back, we can see here in Joel 2:7, it says, they charge like mighty men. The word mighty is the word Gabor. So Gabor means strong or mighty. The reason why this is important is because when this word is used last, it shows up in Genesis 6:4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and afterward as well, when the sons of God had relations with the daughters of men, and they bore them children who became the mighty men of old, men of renown. So Nephilim Nephilim is the Hebrew word, but if we take a look at the word in the Greek word we get is gigantes. That's in the Greek Septuagint. Giganti, or gigantic, is where we get the word giant from. So we can see that there were giants in the earth in those days, as well as later. And it says, when the sons of God, which we know from our other studies are the angels, had relations with men, or the daughters of men. And they bore children who became, and here's the word Gabor again, mighty men. So we can see there's a connection to the word giant, or Nephilim, and the word mighty. And notice it didn't say that the children were mighty men. It says who became mighty men. Genesis 10 and 8. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who began, here it is again, to be a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. So it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. So we can see the same word that's used when it describes the Nephilim, the giants, mighty. It shows up when describing the locusts, God's army, but it also shows up when describing Nimrod and the father of Nimrod, as they were both described as mighty. But they weren't described as being mighty as in when they were born. It's that they became mighty. They began to be mighty. Nimrod and his father Cush are both described as becoming mighty, a Gaborim. The Nephilim giants were also described as becoming mighty. The question is, was King Nimrod a Nephilim? Was King Nimrod a giant? If we take a look at artwork, we can see this is actually a bust of Gilgamesh, which is believed to be Nimrod, and we'll connect that dot in a moment. But if you take a look here, Nimrod or Gilgamesh, if you look at him, you can see that he is very tall in stature. And the way that you know that is because in his hand is not a cat, in his hand is a lion. He is literally gripping a lion with one hand, which would mean that he would be quite large in stature. Here's another depiction. Nimrod is holding a tree in one hand and a reindeer in the other. So reindeers we associate with Christmas, but same with a tree. And you can see Nimrod. He has angel wings on his back. It's like he's being depicted as some kind of a heavenly being. What were the sons of God? Heavenly beings. What were their children? Giants. So is Nimrod a giant? Is he one of the children of the sons of God? We can see here, if he's holding a tree and he's holding a reindeer, again, he has a very tall stature. If we take a look in the Wikipedia and we look at this article on Nimrod, it says, in the Hungarian legend of the enchanted stag, or more commonly the white stag or silver stag, King Nimrod, Menro, often described as Nimrod the giant, or the giant Nimrod, descendant of one of Noah's most wicked sons, Cam, is the first person referred to as the forefather of the Hungarians. So what we're doing here is we're overlapping Nimrod with Nimrod with a Hungarian legend. He, along with his entire nation, is also the giant responsible for building the Tower of Babel. So the Hungarian legend has a story about the tower. So now we have books outside the Bible, mythologies outside the Bible, confirming the building of the Tower of Babylon, construction of which was supposedly started by him 201 years after the event of the Great Flood. After the catastrophic failure, through God's will, of that most ambitious endeavor, and in the midst of the ensuing linguistic cacophony, Nimrod the giant moved to the land of Ivilat, where his wife, Enna, gave birth to twin brothers Hunar and Magyar, aka Magor. Fathers and sons, all three of them, prodigious hunters, but Nimrod especially is the archetypal consummate legendary hunter and archer. So Nimrod was a hunter and an archer. And this is really interesting because, of course, Nimrod was actually overlapped with the constellation Orion. So the reason why all children seem to know Orion's belt goes back to Nimrod. It was said that when he died, the mythology was that he had ascended to heaven, and he ascended to heaven where Orion's belt is. What's really interesting is when we actually take a look a couple pictures back here and we see Nimrod holding the lion within his hand. If you look at the constellation Orion, there's a couple ways it's typically depicted. The constellation Orion is depicted as a man holding a shield, or the shield sometimes is replaced with a lion. That would match exactly what we see here in this rock bust. Another way that the constellation Orion is depicted as a man holding an archer's bow and arrow. So again, when we take a look at the description of Nimrod being a hunter and an archer, and the story about his ascension into the heavens in the constellation of Orion, we depict the constellation Orion today when we draw out the constellation as Nimrod, holding either the lion in his hand, sometimes a shield, or the archer. In the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri, written around 1308, 1321, Nimrod is portrayed as a giant, which was common in the medieval period, when the giants, Ilphitus, Antaeus, Brius, Tityos, and Typhon, he stands in chains on the outer edge of hell's circle of treachery. So we have a couple sources outside the Bible affirming the fact that Nimrod was viewed as a giant. We can also see it in artwork. But if we look at this word Gabor in the Bible, Gabor points us towards mighty, and mighty shows up in the same sentences as the giants. If we look in the Jewish Encyclopedia under the name Nimrod, it says, two prominent theories are held in regard to Nimrod's identity. One, adopted by G. Smith and Jeremias, is that Nimrod is to be identified with the Babylonian hero Uzdubar, or Gizdubar, also known as Gilgamesh. So Gilgamesh was that rock bust that we were looking at. So the Jews believe that Nimrod of the Bible is Gilgamesh of history. The name's different because Nimrod was actually supposed to be a slang name. The name was actually associated to, it's a type of mockery. Nimrod is where you get ideas like an idiot. When you call someone a Nimrod, you're calling them an idiot. And we looked at the word Nimrod, and we also looked at the constellation Orion, and we saw that there was a overlap with the idea of being stupid. So it says the second of that of Thais, Pinches, and others identifies Nimrod with Marduk, the Babylonian Mercury. The former identification is based on the fact that Izdubar is represented in Babylonian epos as a mighty hunter, always accompanied by 4 dogs, and as the founder of the first great kingdom in Asia. So when we see the constellation Orion, we see 2 dogs. One dog is Canis Major, the other is Canis Minor. We can also see that the Qumran caves, so the Dead Sea Scrolls, when they were searching through Qumran and found these different tablets, they found the Book of Giants. And within the Book of Giants, again, there's a reference to Gilgamesh being a giant. And Gilgamesh, of course, again, is Nimrod, according to the Jewish Encyclopedia. So we have multiple sources to agree that Nimrod was a giant. Gilgamesh was a giant. So when we're reading in the Bible that it says that Nimrod was a Gabor, it means that he was a mighty one. He was a giant. As a matter of fact, we can take a look and see if Gilgamesh was actually a giant as well outside of that other source. It says, by modern measurements, Gilgamesh stood 5.5 meters tall. His massive physical stature, according to Hell, is a symbol of other superlative aspects of his personality. As in other great epics, the restlessness of the protagonist is a central part of Gilgamesh, according to Hell. So going back to the locusts in Joel 2 come during the day of the Lord. The locusts are described as Gabor, which means mighty. In Genesis 6:4, the Nephilim, the giants, they're also described as becoming mighty. Nimrod is described as becoming mighty in Genesis 10:8. Nimrod is recorded as being a giant in the Hungarian legends. The Jewish Encyclopedia equates Gilgamesh to Nimrod, and Gilgamesh, like Nimrod, was depicted as a giant. So there must be some kind of a connection between the giants of the Bible and the locusts. The locusts are described as the army of the Lord. So God has an army, and it's not his Christian soldiers. The army of the Lord Are the locusts. Joel 2:11. The Lord raises his voice in the presence of his army. Indeed, his camp is very large. For mighty are those who obey his command. For the day of the Lord is great and very dreadful. Who can endure it? What I find really interesting is when we take a look at the locusts are the army. But as I mentioned, the Christians aren't God's army. We're not called Christian soldiers. So then what are we? We're supposed to be priests. And when you look at ideologies like Masonry with their two pillars, one pillar represents severity. The other pillar represents mercy. What did Christ ask the Pharisees to be? More merciful. So if you take a look, you can see that this idea of the army of the Lord and the priests of the Lord, the Christians would be the priests, and then the Lord's army would be the locusts. That's the two pillars, mercy and severity. The book of Joel parallels with the army in Revelation. So when we compare Joel 2, we're going to see that Joel 2 points us to the New Testament, to Revelation 9. Joel 2:7-10. They charge like mighty men. They scale the walls like men of war. Each one marches in formation, not swerving from the course. They do not jostle one another. Each proceeds in his path. They burst through the defenses, never breaking ranks. They storm the city. They run along the wall. They climb into houses, entering through the windows like thieves. Before them, the earth quakes, the heavens tremble. The sun and moon grow dark, and the stars lose their brightness. So again, the sun and moon grow dark. The sky is being blacked out. Let's look at Revelation 9:1-2. Fifth trumpet, the locusts. Then the fifth angel sounded his trumpet, and I saw a star that had fallen from heaven to earth, and it was given a key to open the pit of the abyss. What's the abyss? The underworld, hell. The star opened the pit of the abyss, and smoke rose out of it like the smoke of a great furnace. And look at this part. And the sun and the air were darkened by the smoke of the pit. So here we haven't seen the locust yet in Revelation 9, but we can see that there is an angel that comes down from heaven. It has a key. The key is actually opening the pit, hell. And then when the pit is opened, smoke comes out of the pit. Of course, hell is hot, it's fire. So it's like a great furnace. There's smoke that comes out. And so much smoke comes out of the ground that it blocks the sun and the air. This sounds exactly like Joel 2, Day of the Lord, where the sky is darkened. If we keep reading, it says, and out of the smoke, locusts descended on the earth, and they were given power like that of scorpions of the earth. They were told not to harm the grass of the earth or any plant or tree, only those who did not have the seal of God on their foreheads. The locusts were not given power to kill them, but only to torment them for 5 months. And their torment was like stinging of a scorpion. In those days, men will seek death, and they will not find it. They will long to die, but death will escape them. So the pit opens, smoke comes out of the pit, blocks the sky. That's what we see in Revelation. And then out of the pit, what comes out? These locusts. So God's army comes out of the pit. And then it comes up, and it's not harming everyone. It's told not to harm those who had the seal of God on their forehead. So only those who did not have the seal of God on their forehead, they were the ones that were in distress. They were being tormented for 5 months by the locusts. The locusts were told not to harm those with the seal of God. So here's the question. What is the seal of God? If you're not going to be harmed by these things, you have to understand what it is that you're supposed to have to keep yourself protected. Deuteronomy 6:1-8. These are the commandments and statutes and ordinances that the Lord your God has instructed me to teach you, to follow in the land that you're about to enter and possess, so that you and your children and grandchildren may fear the Lord, your God, all the days of your lives, by keeping all his statutes and commandments that I give you and so that your days may be prolonged. Hear, O Israel, and be careful to observe them, so that you may prosper and multiply greatly in the land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and with all your strength. That line actually you can see in the gospel. These words I am commanding you today are to be upon your hearts, and you shall teach them diligently to your children, and speak of them when you sit at home, and when you walk along the road, and when you lie down, and when you get up. Tie them as reminders on your hands and bind them to your foreheads. So what are we tying around our hands and binding to our foreheads? We'll look at the beginning of the chapter. These are the commandments and statutes and ordinances of the Lord. So this is a figurative piece of speech. You can't literally tie the 10 commandments and statutes around your hand and your head. It goes on in Deuteronomy 11:13, and you see it again. So if you carefully obey the commandments I am giving you today, to love the Lord God and to serve him with all your heart and all your soul, then I will provide rain for your land in season, the autumn and the spring rains, that you may gather your grain, new wine, and oil. And I will provide grass in the fields for your livestock, and you will eat and be satisfied. But be careful that you are not enticed to turn aside to worship and bow down to other gods, or the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you. He will shut the heavens so that there will be no more rain, nor will the land yield its produce. And you will soon perish from the good land that the Lord is giving you. Fix these words of mine in your hearts and minds. Again, this is figurative, right? You can't take words and stick them in your heart. Tie them as reminders on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. That's the same thing we saw in Deuteronomy 6. Teach them to your children. Speak about them when you sit at home and when you walk around along the road, and when you lie down and when you get up. So we can see in Deuteronomy 6 and Deuteronomy 11, the 10 commandments, the laws and statutes given to Moses on top of Mount Sinai. These are what are supposed to be tied as reminders to the hand and on the forehead. Now, of course, that's figurative. But if you take a look here, what's going on is we're seeing that the idea of moral law is supposed to be taught throughout all generations to children and spoken of and never forgotten. The 10 commandments are the seal of God. Deuteronomy 6:8, Deuteronomy 11:18. How do we know it's the seal of God? Because of the placement. If we look at Deuteronomy 6:8, it says, tie them as reminders on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Deuteronomy 11:18, fix these words of mine in your hearts and minds. Tie them as reminders on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. I like to bring this up at this point because I think it's a really good way to kind of take away from an argument that's going through the Christian churches. A lot of Christian churches say the 10 commandments are done away with. Okay, you've got a problem. If the seal of God from the book of Revelation is associated to the 10 commandments, laws, and statutes, and then we see in Revelation, the locusts are looking for who has the seal. How could you say that the law has been done away with when the seal of God, the 10 commandments, is being looked for by the locusts to decide who to harm and who not to harm? So you're supposed to keep the law in your mind and practice it in all that you do. What do you mean? Well, when you tie the commandments around your head, it means your thoughts. It's talking about your thoughts. So for example, love the Lord God. These commandments would be the first 4 associated to God. These are associated to your thoughts. When we talk about your neighbors, your friends, these commandments are the last 6 and are associated to your actions. So when we say put the commandments and tie them around your head, we mean keep the law of God in your thoughts. When we talk about your hands, tie them around your hand. We're talking about your works, your actions. So in everything you do, you should have the law being shown. So the actions you commit, that's your hand. Your thoughts have to do with you knowing who God is. That's why God said, have no other gods before me. That's your thoughts. However, in the Bible, Satan also has a seal. It's a mark. And more people know what Satan's mark is than they actually know what God's mark is. It goes to show you what kind of situation we're in. If I ask most Christians, what's the mark or what's the seal of God? They'll look at me and they'll have no idea. But if I was to ask them, what's the mark of Satan? They'll be able to answer the question very quickly. And I find that really interesting because, of course, in most of the churches, what have they done away with? Well, they've done away with the law of God. So we have churches that have done away with the law of God. They don't know what the seal of God is, but they can sure tell you that Satan's seal is the mark of the beast. Funny how that works. Revelation 13:18. And the second beast required all people, small and great. Now let's stop there for a second. What is a beast in the Bible? What are we talking about? We're talking about a nation. We're talking about a nation with corrupt rulership. So when you read the book of Revelation, you see the first beast, the second beast. What are we talking about? Corrupt governments. And the second beast required all people, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, the name of the beast, or the number of its name. So then when we look at the mark that's given by Satan, what is it associated to? Buying and selling. You can't buy or sell unless you get this mark. And the mark is supposed to be where? On the right hand or the forehead. That's interesting. So when God seals people, he seals them through their head and hand, and Satan's doing the same thing, sealing them through their head and hand. But when we talked about God's seal and the head and hand, what were we talking about? Your thoughts and your actions. So then what would be going on in Revelation with the mark of the beast? What would a beast be doing? Sinful things. And then what about the mark on their forehead? Sinful thoughts. If we look at Deuteronomy 6:8, tie them as reminders on your hand and bind them on your foreheads. What are we talking about? The 10 Commandments. Keep them in your head and keep them in the actions that you do. Revelation 13:18. And the second beast required all people, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or their forehead. You can see the overlap here, the similarities. Satan's mark is associated to materialism. In other words, being trapped, living in the physical. God's seal is associated to his law, living in the spirit. When people have the opportunity to get ahead, they typically take it. So if we look in regards to materialism, let's hypothetically say you were put in the situation, you could make $1 billion and you could get away with it, and you had to do something sinful. That would be Satan's mark. You're living in the physical. However, if you follow the law says you can't steal. So even though you had the opportunity to make a ludicrous amount of money, what is one of the disciples taught to do? Well, if it involves lying or cheating, stealing, can't do it. That's living in the spirit. So we can see the difference between Satan and God. God's people live in the spirit. They live for higher moral ideas. Satan's people, how do they live? In the physical. They're always concerned about the physical. They're concerned with things like science. They're concerned with materialism. They're concerned with government and authority. Luke 16:13, no servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. So you see it again in Luke. This dichotomy that we see between Satan and God. Satan and his people, they're all trapped in the world. They're trapped in worldly things and luxuries and money. God's people, they're spiritual people. They seek after higher ideals. They can't be persuaded necessarily by just worldly things. But it gets more clear in Luke 16. Actually, there's two translations. I think I grabbed the one from Matthew. No servant is able to serve two masters. Actually, what I did was, this verse is the same verse, Luke 16:13. It's just another interpretation from another translation. The reason why I showed you this verse is because money is translated differently. If you look at the end of the verse, it says, you are not able to serve God and mammon. So now we don't see money. Instead, we see the word mammon. Who's mammon? If we look in the Wikipedia, we can see an article on mammon. It says, mammon in the New Testament Bible is commonly thought to mean money, material wealth, or any entity that promises wealth and is associated with the greedy pursuit of gain. The Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke both quote Jesus using the word in a phrase often rendered in English, "You cannot serve both God and mammon." In the Middle Ages, it was often personified and sometimes included the 7 princes of hell. Mammon in Hebrew means money. The word was adopted to modern Hebrew to mean wealth.
Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. The light of the body is in the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. But if thine eye be evil, thy whole body shall be full of darkness. If therefore the light that be in thee is darkness, how great is that darkness? No man can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. Ye cannot serve God and mammon. So are the words by Jesus in chapter 6 of Matthew in the New Testament, who seeks to explain to us that one should not look for treasures upon the earth, because this is futile, given that such treasures are prone to erosion by rust and moths, or that such materials can be stolen by thieves. Instead, Matthew seeks to guide believers to seek their treasures in heaven, which will last forever, and this serves as an incentive for people to be righteous and to do good things, for this is the only way into heaven. He also tells us that we already have great treasure in our hearts, and that this is enough for us to be fulfilled, providing we are humble and don't get greedy. Here, Matthew seeks to show believers the emptiness in material possession, and seeks to warn them of the perils of being too fixated on filling one's own pockets. Notice the final line, "Ye cannot serve God and mammon," showing us that one must make a choice as to whether he is rich in mind and body, or rich in earthly possessions and the superficial. In other words, you can't buy your way into heaven. And given the way I don't get promoted on YouTube anymore, and that no one gets notified for new uploads, it's just as bloody well. But what is mammon in this sentence? In the Bible, mammon is commonly thought to mean money or material wealth. You'll notice mammon in this part of scripture is not capitalized, leading us to believe that mammon is not a being, but simply a term. In Hebrew, it literally meant money, before evolving into the more broader term of wealth. In fact, as far as the Bible goes, mammon appears to only be a concept, one that represents greed or the pursuit of personal gain. In post-classical Latin, the term was pronounced as mammona, a term still used today in several languages, usually in a derogatory manner in relation to money and finances. The term also held the meaning of wealth in Hellenistic Greek, where we see the more traditional usage of mammon, used to again mean wealth or profit. In the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, meanwhile, mammon is thought to mean the Semitic word for money, or riches. The term itself would eventually become a pejorative term used by Christians to describe gluttony, greed, and the obsession with the material, or wealth. In Polish, the term mamona is used derogatively as a word for money, while in Slovakia, mamona is sometimes used to refer to a greedy person. Other countries such as Finland and Estonia also adopt a similar sounding word to describe this material wealth, including Germany, where mammon itself is a colloquial term for money, though it is often used in combination with the adjective schnöden, meaning contemptible. So it would pretty much be der schnöden mammon, or the contemptible money. It wasn't until the Middle Ages did mammon become personified, where he would go on to become one of the 7 princes of hell in some classifications. This might have stemmed from what was thought to have been an ancient Syrian deity, who may have shared the same name as Mammon, or at least represented the same things, such as riches, wealth, and gold. How much influence this deity may have had over the demonic figure now represented in literature is not known, and many details about these ancient Syrian gods are pretty hard to come by. Mammon himself is a relatively hard demon to speak of, given that biblically he never actually appears, leading many to believe that this demon was added into religious belief much later on, most likely in the Middle Ages, where some of the earliest personifications of money, wealth, and greed seem to stem from. Some believe that Mammon was just another name for the demon known as Beelzebub, whilst others, including the 4th century saints Cyprian and Jerome, believe that Mammon was an evil demonic master that enslaved those who were driven by riches and financial abundance. A 12th century bishop of Paris named Peter Lombard had some interesting insights about Mammon, saying that riches are called by the name of a devil, namely Mammon, for Mammon is the name of a devil, by which named riches are called according to the Syrian tongue.
So Mammon is the personification of greed. It's the spirit behind greed. That's why you can either choose God and serve him in the spirit, or you can choose Mammon, another spirit, but you serve him through the material. You serve him by acquiring more material goods. You serve him by becoming a lover of the world. All right. So in 1 John 2 and 15 to 16, it reads, "Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, the pride of life, is not from the Father, but from the world." In Luke 4:5, it says, "Then the devil led him up to a high place and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world." So here we can see this is from the gospel, and this is when Christ is pulled up into a high place after fasting for 40 days and 40 nights. And the devil takes him to a high place, looking down at the world and saying, "You can have all of this." So again, you can see Satan, materialism. His mark is materialism. Romans 12 and 2, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what is good, pleasing, and perfect will of God." So you can see that your conforming to the world is associated to either being in the world and being surrounded by luxuries and money. And money, of course, is the word mammon, and mammon was a spirit that was associated to greed. And so you can either follow mammon, you can follow Satan, the adversary, or you can follow Christ. But you can see that mammon tries to lure you in with materialism, and he tries to lure you in with the love of this world. So the locusts. The locusts torment those who do not keep the law of God. So this is God's army in Revelation 9. Those who don't follow the law of God, they either follow money or they follow the world. So for those of you who don't have the seal of God on your foreheads, there's only two things that you're following. You're following the world and the teachings of the world, or you're just chasing money. If we take a look at Joel 2, Joel 2 is where we saw the locusts first in the Old Testament presented as an army. And this is a verse-by-verse commentary of Joel 8, or Joel 2:8. It says, "They shall not be wounded or cut to pieces, by it not being easy for the sword to pierce and cut them, through the smoothness and smallness of their bodies." See Revelation 9:9. "And besides their numbers being so great, the loss of a few by the use of a sword or a dart or any such flying projectile as the word signifies would be of little consequence and avail, very little to the utter rot, or cutting them into pieces." Now it says here, Kim Chi observes that the word signifies haters of gain. We're going to take a look at this verse in just a moment. And to this sense, Jarkey explains it, and so the Targum, they go to the place whither they are sent, they slay, and they receive not mammon. So here we can see that the locusts, they are separated from mammon. They are separated from the spirit of greed. They're separated from money. This is what we're talking about in Joel 2:8. "Neither shall one thrust another." Who's they? Well, the locusts. They shall walk every one in his path, and when they fall upon the sword, they shall not be wounded. These last words, they shall not be wounded, that's what we were looking at here, where it says they shall not be wounded or cut to pieces. So what it's saying is they shall not be haters, or sorry, this signifies they're haters of gain. So they shall not be covetous. The word they shall not be wounded or cut into pieces is actually talking about covetousness. And I'll show you that here. If we look at this word to cut off or to break off, or the last piece says gain by violence, 12:14, Batsa. It says to cut off, break off, or gain by violence. When you take a look at the Strong's exhaustive concordance, it says this word means to be covetous. So cut off, finish, fulfill, gain greedily, be given to covetousness and greedy. So what is it actually saying here? It says they are not as other enemies to be appeased by money, as Kimchi interprets it. The Targum is they are not to be bribed, as soldiers sometimes may be, and so depart. See Isaiah 13:17, and to this sense are other versions. Isaiah 13:17 reads, behold, I will stir up against them the Medes. Who are the Medes? Medo-Persians, who have no regard for silver and no desire for gold. So here we can see God stirs up another army, and this is in the book of Isaiah. That other army is the Medo-Persian Empire. And notice how the Medo-Persian Empire has no regard for silver, no desire for gold. These are soldiers that can't be bought. You can't bribe them. And that's actually what you're seeing in the book of Joel 2. You're seeing in Joel 2, whoever the locusts are, these soldiers, this army of God, they can't be bribed with money. The locusts, the army of God, they can't be bought. That's important to know. If you have an army of God and that army of God is against Satan, well, if Satan represents materialism and money and mammon, well, they wouldn't want mammon. They wouldn't want the spirit. They wouldn't want to be bought. In Revelation 9:7-11, where we see the locusts, it says, and the locusts looked like horses prepared for battle, with something like crowns on their heads, and faces like the faces of men. They had hair like that of a woman, and teeth like those of lions. They also had thoraxes like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the roar of many horses and chariots rushing into battle. They had tails with stingers like scorpions, which had the power to injure people for 5 months. So when we see the locusts tormenting people, we see this number of 5 months come up twice. Why is the number 5 important? Well, for one, we see it's the 5th trumpet, but also the number 5 associates to the pentagram. And the pentagram is a symbol for Venus. And we know that the locusts have another god that they follow. While they are the army of God, their king is not the Father in heaven. They have another god. We're going to look at that in a moment, but let's look at Joel 2:4, because Joel 2:4, which we said is connected to Revelation 9, again, we can see this army of God is depicted with the appearance of horses. And then, of course, this army, these locust army that's depicted as horses, here's where their god's located, or at least where it says the name. Revelation 9:11, we get the location of their god and the name of their god. They were ruled by a king, the angel of the abyss. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon. In Greek, it is Apollyon. So the locusts, while they are the army of God, their king is not the Father in heaven. Their king is not Christ, the King of Kings, Lord of Lords. Their king is the angel of the abyss. And the two names we have for the angel is one in Hebrew, which is Abaddon. The other name is Apollyon. So it's interesting. We have an army with a middleman, and the middleman is Abaddon. And then Abaddon obviously takes orders from who? Father in heaven. So who is the locust king? Who is Abaddon? Who is Apollyon? If we take a look at the word Arba, Arba is 697. That's the Old Testament version of the word locust. This word Arba has an origin, and the word is Rabbah, R-A-B-A-H. If we look at this word Rabbah, Rabba means to be or become, many or much. So there must be people in this world, obviously, that are worshiping another god, but that other god, or this other angel in the abyss, is serving the God of heaven. But this word locust goes back to be many or become much. Do you recognize the Hebrew root word rabbah behind locust? If you were with us last week when we were studying the Pharisees and the Sadducees, this word rabbah should stand out to you. Where did the word rabbi come from? If we look at the word rabbi, 4461, it means my master or my teacher. If we look at the word rabbi, it has a Hebrew origin, which is rab. So now we're going from the Greek to the Hebrew. If we look at this word rab, 7227b, it means chief, which makes sense because rabbi means master, and a chief would be a master. But if you look, you'll notice that the word rabab is the origin of the word rab. So rab means rabbi. Rabbi came from rab, which means chief, and rab came from rabab. Rabab means to be or become many or much. Are you seeing what's going on here? When we look at the word rabab and we look at the word rabbi, they mean the same thing. The word rabbi and the word locust go back to the root word rabab. If we look, Talmud, Persian elements. So this is the Encyclopedia Iranica. Why are there Persian words? Because rabbi is not a Jewish word, it's a Persian word. Talmud, Persian elements. While the Jews of the Parthian and Sasanian Empire spoke Eastern Aramaic, not Middle Persian, Persian influence on Judaism through the Babylonian Talmud is by no means negligible. The Bavli is full of Iranian words and motifs, such as the resurrection of the dead, the last judgment, that are familiar in Zoroastrianism. So wait a minute. We have Persian influence showing up in Judaism. So this word rabbi then is not a Christian word. And this is why Christ didn't want the rabbis to call each other rabbi. Rabbi actually came from Persia. And Persia is where you find Babylon. And what we saw in the Old Testament was the kingdom of Babylon was conquered by the kingdom of Persia. It looks like influence came into Judaism, and they created a religion that was actually based on Persian elements, hence where the word rabbi came from. So in the Bible, the Pharisees are the ones that rejected Christ, actually the Pharisees and Sadducees or Sadducees. The Pharisees are where you get the word rabbi. Sadducees didn't call themselves rabbi, but the Pharisees did. Rabbi is a word that came from Persia. Persia is east of Israel. The locusts, when we first saw them in the book of Exodus, where do they come from? They came from the east. So Persia is east of Jerusalem. The locust came from the east. Rabbi is a Persian word. The rabbis rejected Christ. If they rejected God, that must mean they had another God that they accepted. If you look back, you can actually see here in the Encyclopedia Iranica, notice it says that the Persians, in the last sentence, they had themes such as a resurrection of the dead, a last judgment, which are familiar in Zoroastrianism. What's Zoroastrianism? A Persian religion. So the Persians have the idea of the resurrection, just like the Bible does, a resurrection of the dead, and the Persians also had the theme of the last judgment. So if Jews were familiar with these themes and they were held captive in Babylon and received the Persian influence, can you see how they could blur it? They could blur the theme of the resurrection of the Persians with the resurrections of the Old Testament and New Testament. But take a look at this. What else came from the East in the Bible? The Magi visit the Messiah. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the East came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose. We have come to worship him." Where did the Magi come from? We've studied this before. According to the Zoroastrian faith, They came from Iran. The Magi are the Zoroastrians. Rabbi came from Iran. The resurrection shows up in Iranian literature, but not in a Christian sense. And the Last Judgment shows up in Iranian literature, but again, not in a biblical sense. But if we take a look at this word magi, some people say three kings or three wise men, but the word is magos, which means magi. It's a magician. Notice what the definition is. A Magian. Where's the Magian from? An Oriental astrologer. Okay, so where's the Orient in regards to where Israel is? It's towards the east. So we can see here the Magi were astrologers, which makes sense because they follow the star to find Christ. They came from the east. That's where the Zoroastrians came from. And east is Persia. And we see words like rabbi, and the rabbis, those were the Pharisees. They were obviously influenced from Eastern nations. And we can see that the word magos could be a sorcerer, a magician, a wizard. But here's the interesting part. When we look at the origin of the word magi, it says of a Persian origin. Well, that makes sense because they came from Persia. And then notice what the word is. Rab Meg. Rab sounds like rabbi, and Meg sounds like magi. Rab Meg 7248, perhaps a chief soothsayer, an official of the Babylonian king. Okay, well, Persia defeated Babylon. Are you starting to see the overlaps here? Word origin from Rab and a word of foreign origin. Okay, Rab, we should start to recognize this one. Rab means chief. And chief is where we got rabbi, because rabbi goes back to Rab, which means chief, and rabbi means master. But notice how Rab goes back to Rabab, and Rabab means to become many or much. So wait a minute, we have an association between three words then, and they're all words that are pointing towards the east. We've got Rab Meg, which points us towards magi. We've got rabbi, which points back to Rab and Rabab, just like Rab Meg. And then we have locust, which points back to Rabab. The word rabbi, the word magi, and locust all originate from the word Rabab. Coincidence? Revelation 9:11. They were ruled by a king, the angel of the abyss. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek, Apollyon. So who was ruled by a king, the angel of the abyss? Was it the Pharisees? Was it the rabbis? Are the rabbis associated to this angel of the abyss? Remember, they rejected God when God came. So if God is not who they serve, who is this angel of the abyss? Do the Pharisees follow Abaddon, Apollyon? Is this why the Pharisees rejected Christ? Did the Pharisees adopt a Persian or Babylonian deity after their captivity in Babylon? If we take a look here, we can see this book called the Zohar, and it shows up here, the Zohar, my Jewish learning, the symbol of the Kabbalah. The tree of life is nested here in sacred geometry, the ancient flower of life, matrix, mysticism, Zohar. So the Kabbalah is the Zohar. Where did the Zohar come from? Because, of course, Kabbalah is not in the Bible. Zohar, well, that's not a biblical thing either. That's Persian. The Zoroastrians is where it sounds like this is coming from, which would be Persian. If we look, we have the Zohar in the Wikipedia. In the Bible, the word Zohar appears in the vision of Ezekiel 8:2 and is usually translated as meaning radiance or light. It appears again in Daniel 12:3. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens. That's interesting because when we were looking at previous verses about the locust, along with the rock badger, along with the serpent, was depicted as being wise. And then we see this connection to the word Zohar, and the Zohar appearing in Daniel having to do with light and wisdom. This is Rabbi Isaac Meyer Wise. This was said in the 1920s. I believe the newspaper it was published in was the New York Times. Freemasonry is a Jewish establishment whose history, grades, official appointments, passwords, and explanations are Jewish from beginning to end. Now, Masonry we've looked at before, and we saw that those are the ones in the Bible that were called the builders. And they were the builders that rejected the chief cornerstone. What was the chief cornerstone in the Bible? Well, that was a symbol for Jesus Christ. Who else rejected Jesus Christ in the Bible? The Pharisees. Who were the Pharisees? They were Jews. So here we have Freemasonry, which is being influenced by Judaism, but Judaism that rejected Christ. And then where do we see the Pharisees' knowledge came from? Persia, Iran. If we look at mystic Masonry, we can take a look and see at the top of the Masonic religion, because it is a religion, we have the old wisdom religion. And what's at the top? We've got science and philosophy. So that means that the religion of Freemasonry is based on science and philosophy. And then we can see here that right below the word religion, we have the word the Vedas. Well, the Vedas, doesn't that point us right back to Persia? Sure does. Vedic elements in ancient Iranian religion of Zarathustra. Zarathustra is Zoroastrianism. So here we are, Vedic elements in ancient Iranian religion. So Iran is Babylon. Vedic, that's what we saw in this picture here at the top of the chart. So that means that the religion of Masonry, which was influenced by Judaism, which was influenced by the Persians, you can see the connections now, ancient Iran. History of Iran, the origins of the Aryan people. The word Aryan has roots in the world that Iranians called themselves by Arya, meaning free, noble, and steady. That's interesting because you have a group called Free Masonry, and then you have the Aryans called free. If you take a look at the Washington Monument, we know Washington was a Freemason. Inside of the monument, directly over the picture of George Washington, we see the symbol of the sun with 2 wings and 2 serpents. Can we also find that symbol in Persia? Of course we can. It's called Zoroastrianism. It's called the Farfavar. And if you take a look, you can see I'm pointing to it in the picture here. So this is inside the Washington Monument. So then in Washington, D.C., we can see a Persian influence. And remember, there's a sun in the center. And if you look in the center of the sun, what do you see? A 6-pointed star. Where do you see a 6-pointed star in the world? On the flag of Israel. This symbol is called the Faravar. I'm probably pronouncing this horribly, but Faravavar. The Faravar was depicted on the tombs of Achaemenid kings, such as Darius the Great and Artaxerxes III. These are kings that show up in the Bible. And Darius was the one that allowed the Jews to leave Babylon. He was a Persian leader, leave Babylon and go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Now think about it. If God has an army and the army serves him, and Darius is Persian, and the Persians allow them to come back and then rebuild their temple, are you starting to connect the dots? Remember, it was the Persians in the Bible in the book of Isaiah who could not be bought with silver and gold. What do we learn about the locusts? The same thing. They don't care about silver and gold. So God's army doesn't care about material things. So then if we're looking at Farfavar and we're looking at all these symbols, who exactly is Apollyon? Who's Abaddon? Is he Satan? No. Satan's the one that's up above, and he gets pulled down below and brought to the bottomless pit. So then who's the angel in the bottomless pit? I would assume it's Azazel. It says the symbol was also used on the coin mints of Phrataraka of Persis in the late 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. So again, we're going back to the Vedas because Vedas is Persian, and Persian is where we're getting this Farfavar and all the symbolism we see in Freemasonry. And Freemasonry we know is not a concoction of its own. Freemasonry goes back to Judaism. And Judaism is not of the Bible. Judaism appears to be Persian paganism. Remember, Christ told his people not to call themselves rabbi. Don't call yourselves a master. Matthew 23, 6 and 12. They love the places of honor at banquets, the chief seats in synagogues, the greetings in the marketplace, and the title of rabbi by which they are addressed. Who are we talking about? The Pharisees. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth your father, for you have one Father, who is in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. The greatest among you shall be your servant. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Christ said, do not call each other rabbi, because the word means master. And rabbi, we saw, goes back to the word chief, right? Rab, chief. And it means to be multiple or many, or to know many things is how they translate it. Rabbi is a term that we see used in Israel. However, on the other side, we see, do not call each other father. And who's doing that? The Roman Catholics. You have the Pontifex Maximus, the Pope, and you have the bishops, and you have the priests, and they call themselves what? Father. Have they not read the gospel? It makes sense to me that the Pharisees, Israel, it would make sense that they would reject the New Testament, but the Catholics claim to be the authority of the Bible. So why are they calling each other father? If you take a look, we can see the rabbi and the Pope, they dress very similar, and neither of which is described in the Bible. The rabbis typically dress in black, and rabbi means master. The Pope dresses in white, and Pope, the Pontifex Maximus, goes by the name of Father. Both of these titles were not to be used, and both of these men look like they're almost mirroring each other in their clothing. They're both wearing a very distinguishable headdress, and this headdress does not show up anywhere in the Bible. So to see both Israel and Rome wearing the same headdress, that's quite interesting. In Israel, this headdress is called the kippah or yarmulke. It looks like it's written yarmulke, but it's yarmulke. So kippah or yarmulke. The yarmulke spelling is the Yiddish way of saying it. And then if we look at what the Pope has on his head, what's that thing? It's called a zucchetto. And I've actually studied this and found out that this headdress goes all the way back to the Druids. Well, who are the Druids? The Druids are the Aryans. Wait a minute. If we have the rabbis going back to the word rab, and rab points us back to Persia, well then, if we have the Aryans, this is the same thing. We have the same religion. One's wearing white, one's wearing black, but it's all coming from the same place. Because if zucchetto is going back all the way to the Druids, well, the Druids are the Aryans. And of course, the rabbis, the word itself is going back to Persia. And that's where the Aryans are from. So what we have is we have two different groups practicing the same religion. One is fire, one is water. You find that in Judaism, there's a lot of emphasis put on Yahweh. There's obviously no Christ, which means they've replaced Christ with the Father. But of course, the Father said, you can't use my name directly. You can't call on me directly. You have to come through my Son. But they're not doing that. It's like they've made the Father into the one they pray to. And then on the side of the Pope calls himself the Father as if you're praying to the Pope. So you can see the similarities here. It's two apostate groups that both deviated from the Bible, but they both adopted the same religion, except one is associated to a masculine figure, that's on the left with the rabbis, but the other side must be associated to a feminine figure. So who's the feminine figure? The Queen of Heaven. The Virgin Mary? No, Aphrodite. Her symbols can be seen all around the Vatican. And this is why Martin Luther and the Protestants said, this is the whore of Babylon, Rome. A whore is typically referring to a female. And so we have the rabbis worshiping what they say is the Father, Yahweh, but then we have the Pope, and the Pope is following the Queen of Heaven, who he claims is the Virgin Mary. This is Babylon. In Freemasonry, since we were talking about Masons being influenced by Judaism, which is the rabbinical priests, the Pharisees, the rabbis call themselves rabbi because it means master. Well, if the Freemasons were influenced by the rabbis or the Pharisees, I guess it makes sense why they have the rank of a master Mason. Now, going to the locus, does this connect us to the God that we see in Revelation 9:11? Are the Masons following a different God? Well, take a look. If we see here, this Masonic Lodge, where is it built? Locust Grove Masonic Lodge, number 573. St. Croix Masonic Lodge, number 56. Where is it located? 209 Locust Street. Masonic Temple on Locust Street in Hudson. Masonic Temples, 3610 Locust Ave in Long Beach, California. Why are the Masons building all their temples? Remember, it's a religion. Why are they building them on Locust Street? Would their God be the Locust King from Revelation 9:11? Would their God be the one who commands the army of God? Is he the middleman? Oriental Lodge 453. Where's the Orient? Isn't that in the east? Yeah, this Oriental Lodge is on 505 Locust Street. I hope you like your coincidences. Masonic Lodge 1155 Locust Street, Dubuque. Masonic Lodge, Locust Grove, Oklahoma. Starting to get the picture here. Long Beach Temple Lofts at 835 Locust Avenue. There sure are a lot of Masonic lodges built on Locust Street, Locust Ave, Locust Grove. You'd think they'd have some connection to the locusts in the Bible, considering that every Masonic lodge has the Bible in the center of the room, and the locusts can be found in there as the army of God. Are you starting to see the bigger picture? Can you see what's going on with the Pharisees? Can you see how the Pharisees influenced Freemasonry? Can you see how both the Pharisees and the Freemasons are using Persian symbolism? Did you notice in Isaiah, the Persians were the ones who could not be bought? Did you notice that the locusts, as we mentioned, could also not be bought? Masonry has strong connections to the locust. Judaism, the Pharisees, is the origin of Freemasonry. Abaddon or Apollyon is the angel of the bottomless pit. Abaddon is known as the destroyer. Who is Abaddon? If we take a look, we can see that there's a God called Allah, and Allah is the God of Islam. Now, the interesting thing about Islam is Islam comes from Ishmael, and Ishmael was a child of Abraham. Abraham had two children, Isaac and Ishmael was born first. Here's the strange thing. We've got two sons, one son, Isaac, the other son, Ishmael. They both have the same father, which is Abraham. Why did Ishmael follow Allah, and why did Isaac follow the God of the Old Testament, Ea Asher Ea, the one from Exodus 3:14? Why do they have two different gods if they have the same father? Abraham was not a polytheist. So either Ishmael went towards a different God, or Isaac went towards a different God. And we know it wasn't Isaac. If we take a look at one of the 99 names of Allah, it's the destroyer. Al-Mamut means the destroyer. That's really interesting because in Revelation 9:11, what does it call Abaddon, Apollyon? The destroyer. So who's the angel of the bottomless pit in Revelation 9:11? It would be Allah. Well, take a look at this. Here are the Shriners, the Masons. Remember, the highest degrees in the Masonic order are the Shriner degrees. In order to become a Shriner, a man must first be a Mason. The fraternity of Freemasonry is the oldest, largest, and most widely known fraternity in the world. When a man has achieved the status of Master Mason, he can petition to become a noble of the Shrine of North America. So you got to work your way up Masonry, and then you can become a Shriner. Now, what's interesting about the Shriners? Well, they're called the mystic nobles of the Arabic Shrine. Okay, what was the god of Arabia, or what is the god of Arabia? Allah. Isn't it strange to see men who are European Caucasians that are wearing the Arabian fez? They're not from the Middle East. No, but their god is from the Middle East. And if you notice their symbol, where you see the curved sword with the crescent moon, you'll see a crescent moon on top of the mosque, don't you? And if you take a look, you can see there's a 5-pointed star there. 5-pointed star, the pentagram, what's that associated to? Venus. Who's Venus? Lucifer. Haven't we seen Shriners calling themselves Lucifer? We've seen that video tons of times. So you're starting to see all the connections here. Who's the god of Freemasonry? Well, who's the angel of the bottomless pit? Who's the destroyer? What's Allah's name? The destroyer. The last thing I'll point out is a couple Sabbath studies ago, we did research into King Nimrod, and we followed the Cook manuscript, one of the oldest Masonic manuscripts, called The Legend of the Craft. In The Legend of the Craft, what we learned that King Nimrod was the first Grand Master of Freemasonry. Now watch as you tie all the points together. Locusts have a connection to the word giant, and the reason why is because of the word Gabor, and Gabor means mighty. Nimrod was a giant. Nimrod was actually depicted in the pictures we saw holding a lion and holding it with one hand, clearly a giant. But then we see that there's an overlap here with rabbi going back to locust and magi as well. They're all connected to this word that's rabab. And this is a Persian word. And of course, when we take a look at where Arabia is, the area we call Arabia today, Saudi Arabia, not just Saudi Arabia, but just Arabia as a whole, that's right by Persia. And so it looks like what happened was the Knights Templar, they grabbed this Persian knowledge and they brought it back into Europe. And next thing you know, you have Caucasian men wearing the Arabian fez. So it looks like what's going on in Masonry is you reach the highest degrees and you come to the conclusion that God is who? God is Allah.
For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of the dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Brothers and sisters, the sword is coming. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. That at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow.